Far-right parties are on the rise in Europe, and surprisingly, younger Gen Z voters are a big reason that these conservative parties are surging.
In Germany, 40% of Gen Z voters voted for the far-right party compared to only 20% of senior voters. And in France, the far-right party is the most popular party with Gen Zs and millennials, and shockingly, only 5% of them voted for Macron's party.
Taking it even further in Spain, a quarter of young Spanish men between 18 to 26 believe that authoritarianism is preferable to democracy.
And this trend of Gen Zs favoring far-right parties really came as a surprise. Earlier this year, Germany and Belgium lowered the voting age to 16 at the urging of progressive parties that thought having younger people to vote would help them. But then in the end, it worked against them, and they actually went for far-right parties.
Yeah, for decades, we could really guess the political tendencies of younger people to be liberal and left-leaning. But in recent European elections, progressive thinking has dealt with like a really big pushback at the same time that people are struggling with living expenses, increased inflation, and high rates of immigration.
Sounds familiar. And in the midst of this dire environment, this is crazy, incumbents in every single developed country that held elections this year have lost. It's the first time on record that incumbents lost every single election.
And to just like quickly explain it before we dive into it more, the far-right movement in Europe is basically anti-establishment nationalist, populist ideas coming together and reacting to economic recession, unemployment, migration, and large cultural shifts.
Over the past 10 years, politics across the world has been transformed by a new brand of vicious right-wing populism, restricting women's rights, targeting the LGBTQ community, and empowering violent, far-right nationalist groups.
And what's interesting is that these far-right parties aren't fringe political groups anymore. They're actually in contests to lead countries like Germany, Austria, France, the Netherlands, Spain, Croatia, Finland, Italy, and even more. And EU elections this summer even created the most right-wing EU parliament ever.
And the motivating factor really driving people towards these far-right parties specifically seems to be immigration. For the last decade, Europe has really experienced a huge surge in immigration. Like if we look at Germany, for example, they've averaged 1 million immigrants entering the country every year for the last 10 years. And now a quarter of their population is first-generation immigrants.
I mean, that's a lot for a single country to handle. Like, those immigration numbers are on par with what we're seeing in the US. But the US has a population of over 300 million, and Germany has a population of 80 million. So obviously the government and the people are really feeling the effects of this. And Europe altogether has really been dealing with what they're calling a migration crisis. In the past decade, 29 million immigrants have made their way to the continent.
And now there's this perception that these immigrants are coming in and taking their jobs and taking their affordable housing and committing crimes.
And a lot of the immigrants that we see coming to Europe are from Muslim countries. And this basically started 10 to 15 years ago following the Arab Spring crisis. There has been this sentiment that the rise in Muslim population is diluting Western culture.
So people have turned to far-right parties that have made cracking down on immigration their central message. And as a result, what used to be considered an extreme nationalistic anti-migration view has kind of become the mainstream sentiment in Europe. And that's led to some pretty drastic actions.
Italy's far-right prime minister is trying to send migrants that were rescued in the Mediterranean to detention centers in Albania to kind of like wait for their paperwork and claims to be processed before they're even allowed in Italy. And this was actually tried for the first time just a couple months ago in October. It didn't really work out because European courts said that it violated previous rulings. And when we looked into it further, it was concerning because even the first time that they ever tried this out, there were minors included in the group and people with medical conditions.
It's a super divisive plan. So Doctors Without Borders said it's likely to result in further harm and violation of human rights. But then reportedly other right-wing European leaders see it as a blueprint.
Yeah, this wasn't some like tossed aside weird plan. It was really widely praised. Ursula von der Leyen, who is the politically pandering first female president of the European Commission, actually said Italy's plan was out-of-the-box thinking. And we reached out to her office to talk to her about this plan, but she said she was too busy to speak with us.
Maybe not just European leaders, since last week a Texas official offered the Trump administration 1,400 acres of land in Texas to build deportation camps when he takes office.
Yeah, it's interesting. I can't imagine that these holding centers would have gained any kind of traction 10, even 20 years ago, but now they're becoming this like popular idea.
In Germany, which has been one of the most welcoming countries during this wave of migration, has extended patrols to all its land borders. And Poland plans to introduce legislation to temporarily suspend the right of new arrivals to ask for asylum.
In September, the Swedish government started offering $34,000 to migrants to go home. Sweden actually used to be a very liberal country, but now they're led by a right-wing government that actually stemmed from a neo-Nazi group that rebranded. And critics are questioning this plan because instead of spending all of this money to kind of help immigrants assimilate, they're just paying them to leave.
And that brings us to Turkey, which has been the EU's holding cell for immigrants. In the last 8 years, the EU gave Turkey 11 billion euros to host Syrians and discourage them from continuing on to Europe, basically. But Turkey is growing tired of playing this role and is now using those funds to send migrants back to their home countries.
At a meeting just last month in Brussels, all of these EU leaders came together and spent hours talking about speedier deportations. This was interesting hybrid warfare that actually suggests hostile powers are sending migrants to Europe to destabilize these countries. And like we said, migrant processing centers like Italy suggested.
You'll see words like migrant processing centers instead of deportation camps, or irregular arrivals instead of illegal.
Yeah, and it's because there is a sensitivity to far-right terminology in Europe that is still kind of reeling from the rise of Nazis and fascism after World War II. So they're avoiding any kind of vocabulary that's reminiscent of that time. So their verbiage is a lot softer and more like subtle.
Something we haven't touched on yet is that we're seeing a lot of effective right-wing messengers popping up that really resonate with younger people. So Trump is a great example of that. He turned out a lot of young men, especially to vote. And there's another great example in France. We've already mentioned that the far-right party there is the most popular party with Gen Z voters. And a main reason for that is 29-year-old Jordan Bardella, who's the new face and co-president of Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party.
So he joined the party at 17 and immediately climbed the ranks without any political experience. He didn't even have a university degree. But he was young and handsome and charming, which is exactly what the far-right National Rally Party needed to, shift their image. He has very extremist anti-immigrant views. He's vowed to block access to free medical treatment for undocumented immigrants and even end the ability of children born in France by foreigners to automatically qualify for citizenship when they turn 18.
He has millions of devoted fans on TikTok that love him, love his behind-the-scenes videos at political events. He kind of just looks like a well-dressed influencer on there, honestly.
C'est quoi le problème avec nos électeurs? On est des sous-citoyens. On n'a pas le droit de considérer qu'il faut réduire l'immigration en France sans être traité de raciste.
And it's attracted more young supporters than ever before, and it helped them pull off a landslide victory in the EU Parliament elections. And in Europe, 1/3 of young people say they rely on TikTok to keep up with politics.
Yeah, in Germany, the far right, sometimes even classified as extremist, AfD party has used social media to really get young voters. And if you look at their TikTok, they actually have a bigger social reach than all of the parties in Germany combined.
And a lot of far-right parties are relatively newer, so they don't have the money of the more established parties, so they have to rely on social media to get their message out there, and thus they end up reaching mostly young people.
So this is probably a good jumping off point for us to discuss whether any of these claims that we're talking about against immigrants and refugees have any validity or whether they're just fear-mongering.
Yes, so let's start with jobs. A first-of-its-kind paper found that immigrants cause low-educated native workers to lose out on jobs in the short term, but those jobs all come back in the long term, and immigrants actually increase job opportunities for high-educated workers.
Yeah, it's funny to see these right-wing leaders kind of grapple with their stance on immigrants when it comes to work, because like you said, a lot of them are kind of just like, immigrants are taking our jobs, leave. But on the other hand, Europe is dealing with an aging population and really low birth rates, so they need immigrants to populate the workforce.
Yeah, that's a lot to reconcile. So moving on to crime, EU research released last year reviewed 17 research projects and found there's no evidence of immigration leading to an increase in crime, and it actually disproved that link.
And for the immigrant-driven crime that does exist, it's largely related to failed asylum seekers, which are basically people that have come to Europe under asylum whose applications were rejected. And 80% of failed asylum seekers never leave, according to EU data, which obviously pisses off a lot of Europeans.
Feels kind of unfair that this narrative narrative is being applied to all immigrants across the board.
And then there's housing. So immigrants are being blamed for taking up affordable housing, but there's gentrification and corporations that are buying properties and like driving up costs.
Plus, immigrants make up a proportionally larger share of construction workers, so they positively contribute to housing that way. And they also pay taxes, which benefits everyone. And research shows that migrants contribute more to the national budget than they take out.
There have been some horrifying instances of anti-immigration violence just this year. In England, far-right rioters yelled slurs at a Pakistani man, dragging him out of a car and like smashing his car just for being Pakistani. In Germany, a group of 20 teenagers attacked an 8-year-old girl from Ghana, even kicking her in the face and attacking her dad. And both this child and her father ended up having to go to the hospital.
And just last week in France, a Muslim woman was pinned to the ground and beaten for wearing a hijab. The attackers said they intended to kill her, and she suffered a wrist hematoma, fractured ribs, and facial bruising.
And in Europe overall, people have reportedly experienced more racial discrimination than previous years. And some of the worst instances of this are recorded in countries where far-right parties are rising.